refresher on Chapter 1 of Tara Kuther's book, Lifespan Development in Context, A Topical Approach. I've got the original edition, the first edition. This is actually going to be covering the second edition. So I imagine there's quite a bit of overlap, but the second edition has updated details. And I'm just going to be covering the main concepts of each chapter. And so this is Chapter 1, Understanding Human Development, Approaches and Theories. And there are quite a few concepts that are introduced in each chapter. So this is going to be a really quick rundown where I go into a little bit of detail and give examples of these concepts, but I do not want this to be a 90-minute sort of video. So if you need more in-depth practice, I recommend spending some time applying each of these concepts, giving unique examples, thinking of cases that match the concept, but also cases that don't quite match the concept. That's a good way to really stretch out your understanding of information that you cross. So, what is lifespan human development? I really like the way Professor Kuther organizes her book because she doesn't narrow in on one component of development. She looks at how development can be understood from a variety of contexts and perspectives within a person's life. So human development simply talks about any form of maturation and growth. We see that in the body, so the body changes throughout the lifespan, but we also see it in the mind or in the intellect, the ability for us to apply cognitive skills. So there's cognitive development. There's also emotional development. So our ability to recognize, express, and interpret the emotions of others. So recognize and express our own emotions, but also interpret the emotions of others and help them deal with it. So all of these recognize emotional development. And then there's, of course, social development. The types of relationships we can have get increasingly sophisticated over our lifespan. So throughout this book, and because this is a contextual approach, she doesn't look at like the first few years of life and then the next few years of life and then so on throughout the book. So the first few chapters are about the first few years of life and the last few chapters are the last few years of life, and looks at each of these dimensions of development and looks at the whole lifespan. So there will be a focus on cognitive development in the lifespan, physical development in the lifespan, and so on. So it's broken down into the main contexts in which development occurs, and I think that's a helpful way of looking at it. So there are a couple of ways, or a couple of concepts that apply broadly to human development. The first is that development is multi-directional, and so it's not always headed from less to more. In some cases, you start off with more and then wind up with less throughout the lifespan. Sometimes you grow and then get smaller, or there's like growth and then a descent of growth. And so let's think of some examples. Plasticity in neural development is at its highest in your first few years of life. That means that the brain is highly, or because the brain is still growing, it can change in a lot of different directions. That's why children around the age of 6 months, infants around the age of 6 months, develop language very quickly. They recognize the main morphemes that their culture uses, and they can pick that up really quickly. So like within a period of a few weeks, right around the age of 6 months, infants develop this recognition for language. Now, at age 20, we don't have that anymore. So plasticity has gone extremely down from our first year to our 20th year, which is why it's so much harder to learn a language when we're in our 20s than it was when we are in our first few years of life. So learning a language younger is helpful. Now, muscular growth, we start off with almost no muscular control. All of our soft tissue is weak. And then once we reach our 20s, we have the highest capacity for muscular strength, and so we can build muscle very easily. And then already by age 30, that ability starts to decline. By 50 and 60, we start seeing, on average, like an 8 to 10% decrease in muscle mass, and that increases in 60s and so on. And so there's a curve. So in other words, development isn't always more or isn't always up. It moves in a variety of directions. I've talked already about plasticity. That simply means the degree to which something can change. So moral plasticity would be the degree to which your morals could transform from one moment to the next. So you might think of something as black and white in this moment, and then the next moment completely change your mind. Now, most adults don't have moral plasticity. I'm just kind of giving an example there. Neuroplasticity is the big one that we see, especially in infancy and childhood, and that tends to slow down into adulthood, although it never stops completely. Resilience is the degree to which a person can adapt to changing environments. And so, if you grew up in an environment that's protective, that's safe, that's comfortable, and then you find yourself in a brand new one, maybe you were single and now you're married, or you were making lots of money and then you got fired and now you're not, you need to fend for yourself. And so, how well can you handle these changing conditions? And so, what we find with humans is that they tend to be more resilient than we give them credit for. At least in my study of psychology, humans are more resilient than we give them credit for. We are more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. We often don't hold ourselves up to a high enough standard that way. What influences development? Well, there are lots of contexts. So the two extreme contexts are our development is genetically predetermined. And so when we're born, there are certain biological predisposition to who we will become and how that will happen. And then the far other end of the spectrum, our environment, because of our experiences and who is around us and the resources we have access to, those support and sort of direct our development. And the truth is, it's a combination of both of them and myriad other factors. And so, where a person develops, so their immediate environment, maybe it's the culture, traditions, customs, and values, the people who are around them. Growing up myself, I'm a millennial, and so I grew up using social media, but that didn't happen until I was in my late teens. And so Facebook wasn't even invented until I was 18 years old. And so my cohort, my generational cohort, had a lot of influence from television and media, and then later the internet. Now, the cohort after me, the Gen Zers, they had social media much earlier, and they were influenced by social media at a much younger age and an important age in their social development. So there are cohort effects that can help explain how we develop. The cultures in which we find ourselves influence our development, and the way that I teach this course, Human Growth and Development, culture is going to be a big context or a big focus that we will pay attention to. Growing up in the Southeast United States, in rural Georgia, for example, has certain features that that predetermine what we value, where we spend our time, what's important to us, what we consider achieving and success. But if we had grown up even in California or Central America or South Africa or East Asia, these different cultures would influence our perspective considerably. We might think that being 19 years old is the same in any city in the United States or any country in the world, but being 19 means something very different depending on the culture in which that age is seen. So the culture helps influence and helps us understand what qualifies as development and what those developmental benchmarks are. Development isn't only in psychology. Sports scientists are interested in human development. Educators are interested in development. Physicians and medical specialists are interested in development. Biologists, chemists. I imagine we could think of a scenario in which physicists are interested. But development is a human science. And so, career specialists, of course, are interested in development. And psychologists would be a big one, but sociologists are also interested in development. And so there are a lot of different ways that we can approach this topic. That also means that this topic is going to help us better understand a variety of career paths and a variety of subject matters. I quite like this detail human development is continuous and discontinuous. So in order for something to be continuous, it's always ongoing. And so a continuous transition might be in your let's say in I can look at my own identity as a husband. So I became a husband on April 22nd, 2017. And on that moment, I went from not being a husband to being a husband, which was a big shift. And so that's discontinuous. I was not a husband, not a husband, not a husband. And then that date came, now I'm a husband. And so that's discontinuous. But since that point, what I understand as being a husband today, so it's 8 years later. Is that right? Yeah, 8 years later. What I understand now is very different from what I understood then, but there was no point at which that light bulb came on. I was constantly or continuously developing throughout that whole period, the whole 8 year marriage period, um, transforming. I was developing. My understanding was becoming more sophisticated, and so that's continuous. It's always happening. I can't quite point to the spot when I understood what it meant to be a husband, and I wouldn't say I do now, but like my understanding has definitely improved, and it will continue to improve hopefully for the next 20, 30 years. And so that's continuous. But the period at which I went from not being a husband or being single or being engaged to being married, that would be a discontinuous shift because something big happened. And so it was almost like a big step up. And now it's like a gradual change. And so that's continuous and discontinuous. Development doesn't only happen to you, you play a role in facilitating your development. So there's this understanding in human biology of genetics. We are genetically determined, and so written into our genes and chromosomes are certain organismic potentials, and so and that genetic code actualizes itself, but it doesn't only actualize itself. It also has to occur. It has to be in situations that allow it to occur. And so you might have, just for example, you might have the potential to become very strong. Like you might have the muscular infrastructure and cell or muscle development capabilities of building, like putting on a lot of muscle and becoming very strong. But that won't just happen. You have to put yourself in situations where you can actualize that capability. So you would have to start lifting weights in a systematic way. And if you never started lifting weights, you would never actualize that potential. So it's not just genetics. There's also the role played by your environment and then what you actively do to turn on that possibility, to turn on that capability. I mentioned earlier that there's two extreme poles of understanding how we become the person that we become. On one end, we're genetically predetermined, and so it's in our nature of what we will become. And on the other side, it's the environment and people who are around us that support us in a particular way that make us who we become. That's the nurture part of the argument. So there's nature and there's nurture, and the way the argument goes is which is more important in helping us become who we'll become, or in facilitating our development. And the answer is, well, neither of them. Both are extremely important. In some instances, nature is more important. In other instances, nurture is more important. So for example, if you are biologically incapable of having children, you're infertile, for example, then that would be a natural predisposition to infertility or a predisposition to not bearing children. But that doesn't mean you can't adopt. And so there would be a genetic component there, and maybe you would still choose to become a parent. And so what you learn about parenting in your environment might lead you to expand your understanding of what it means to be a parent. So that nurture would actually, even though nature sort of predicted that you wouldn't become a parent, nurture supported your development in actually becoming a parent. So not a biological parent, but a social parent when you adopt somebody. Or the reverse, maybe you were highly fertile, but you grew up in an environment where parenting was frowned upon or having children was frowned upon, and so you chose not to have children. In that sense, nurture is what created that trajectory for you. All right, so perspectives on human development. Before we look at those perspectives, a couple of concepts, a couple of vocabulary words. A theory, well, let me go on, use hypothesis first. A hypothesis is an explanation about why something occurs. It's a statement about the nature of reality. And so in the context of human development, it might be a proposal for why humans develop the way that they do, or a proposal that humans will develop in a particular way. And so a hypothesis is a scientific statement that can be tested by subsequent research. Now, if there's a hypothesis about child rearing, for example, then a bunch of tests would be designed to help or to prove that hypothesis wrong. And if no test can prove that hypothesis wrong, then the hypothesis will stand and we'll have a pretty good understanding of why development occurs in a particular setting or a particular context. If a lot of research is all devoted to that same idea, eventually we will evolve a theory, which is an overarching way of organizing all of those different studies. So a theory is an advanced set of lots of hypotheses that have been tested. And so there are probably about 20 big theories in the history of development, at least as looked at from a Western perspective. And in the United States, we represent this Western perspective. One of the very first ones was the psychoanalytic theory of development. So throughout this book, we will look at Freud's theory of personality and how the personality changes throughout the lifespan. But that started off as a hypothesis rooted in empirical data as derived from psychoanalytic studies and therapy sessions. And then over time, there was enough evidence accrued that all kind of pointed to and fit within this system of understanding that it's a standalone way of understanding human development. Erik Erikson, it was a neo-Freudian who had his own set of socio-emotional stages of development. We'll look at him as well. And there are a couple of other big theories of development that have been derived over years and years and years and that have stood the test of time. So like we're talking centuries at this point. The one that I mentioned, Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalytic theories are based on this idea that human behavior is motivated by these unseen drives. Those drives are like the desire to procreate or have sex, the desire to eat and drink, these like inner base desires. And these desires need to be expressed. And if we hold them back, then we're stunting our development. And if we express them, then we have this capacity for growth. And so there's a whole developmental system around this idea that there are these drives that need to find expression, or else all sorts of problems will occur. Sigmund Freud was the first one. He had the psychosexual theory, and the root there is that every human motivation is rooted in the desire for sex, broadly construed, and he's often criticized for that. Erikson was also a psychoanalyst, and his proposal wasn't just sexual. It was about the relationships and how our capacity for relating to people changes through our lifespan. At first, we're like helpless. We need people to take care of us, and we trust that life will be okay. Or we don't ever achieve that trust, and we are a basket case for like our entire life. We don't trust anything. We're always worried that the shoe is going to drop. But we'll look at both of them throughout this textbook. All right, so this just goes into detail of Freud's theory and then Erikson's theory. Now, in the 1920s, Freud was the early 1900s. 1901, I think, was one of his first essays about psychoanalysis, and it developed throughout the next few decades, and then others picked up his torch and ran with it. Behaviorism started in the 1910s, but officially in the 1920s as a psychological discipline. And it was rooted around the idea that everything is nurture, that you're born a blank slate, and that things happen to you that create the person that you become. So John Watson had this famous edict that if you gave him a baby, he could turn them into anything at all, like a concert pianist, or like a famous painter, an impressionist painter, or whatever, or like a mass murderer. Like he could create conditions that would produce anybody that he chose. And so behaviorism is based on that, that we can shape anyone into anything. And there's quite a bit of evidence that we can shape, but the same school, behaviorist school, found that there are biological principles that prohibit some, or that impose some limits on that. So genetic predispositions may make it impossible for someone to become a concert pianist, for example. Maybe they lack dexterity in their fingers. All right, um, there are a couple of other approaches that can be used. The first two that I talked about, psychoanalysis and behaviorism, are broad theories of human development. But there are also perspectives that help us understand developmental data. And so these ones come from social learning theory and behaviorism. And so we don't just learn based on what people um, tell us to learn or how they interact with us. We can also watch other people, um, like other parents, parent and see what happens and kind of learn simply by watching what worked for them and what didn't. A lot of us learn a lot simply by watching our parents and what they do. And maybe we learn how to parent that way. Or if we're a new student at a school, we might watch other students and see the way that they behave and how professors or teachers interact with them, and learn that way. So it's possible to learn without anything ever happening to us. We're simply watching it happen. So that's part of it. But we can also experience it directly, and this is where the behaviorism proper comes in. If we, let's say we try a new sleep schedule for our children, and no one gets any sleep, well, then we would learn based on our own experience, the feedback that we got naturally, that model doesn't work. We need to try something different. I'm not familiar. Let's see, reciprocal determinism. Okay, so that simply means that we change our environment and then our environment changes us. So it's this ongoing feedback loop. Let's say, I'm trying to think of like a good example where this might happen. Oh, making friends for the first time. In elementary school, we spend all our time before elementary school with our family, and we've never interacted with anyone outside our family. Then we find ourselves in kindergarten or preschool, elementary school, trying to make new friends, and we realize that people behave differently than they do at home. And so who we are changes these other kids, and these other kids change who we are. And so it's this reciprocal feedback loop. Our behaviors influence those around us, and then their responses to our behaviors influence us. And so it goes back and forth. It's not only the environment that changes us, it's not only us that changes the environment, it goes both ways. It's reciprocal. Another whole area of development looks only at the mind and how the mind changes, and so these are called cognitive theories. So cognitive developmental psychologists look at how thoughts change throughout our lives and how our ability to produce thoughts change. They also look at how thoughts can influence behavior and motivation. A big topic in psychology is mood disorders, and we know that our thoughts can influence our emotions, and our emotions can influence our behaviors, and our behaviors can influence both our thoughts or both our emotions and our thoughts, and our thoughts can influence our behaviors. And so it's this triangle of reciprocal interactivity. So cognitive, or the thought portion, is an important part of that. Piaget is one of the first and most significant developmental psychologists to look at cognitive development, and he had 4 stages of development he looks at. All right, so I recommend taking a closer look in the textbook about those stages of cognitive development. They go from the simplest cognitive development is the ability to like interact with the world physically without modeling understanding with symbols. And then the most advanced stage is the ability to think abstractly, where we can solve problems even though there are certain variables that aren't present to us. So if you've ever taken algebra and you can like look at letters and know that letters represent numbers and solve a problem based on that understanding, That means that you can do abstract thinking. All right, I am slide 17 of 33, and this has been, I don't have like a running timer, but I imagine this is going much longer than I had hoped. So let me try to speed things up a little bit. There's the information processing theory in cognitive developmental psychology, which is the understanding that the mind isn't this black box, but it's more like a computer. The black box is something we can't see directly. But if our mind works just like a computer, you can put a command into the computer and then the output comes through like the printer. That's this information processing model. And unfortunately, I would say this is as advanced as cognitive psychology has gotten at this point. It's very difficult to describe any thought action without using the computer metaphor. Memory, for example, we think of as I stored something on my hard drive, even though human memory doesn't work that way. Still, that information processing model is rather popular. I've criticized that at length before. If you want to read my other stuff. Liv Vygotsky has a socio-cultural theory of cognitive development, which takes into consideration not just how the mind changes, but how culture can influence that. So again, instead of looking only at mind, it's expanding a little bit to include culture. And that makes sense. Culture culture exposes us to ways of categorizing information, emphasizes what's important, and so because of culture, we might learn Roman numerals instead of Egyptian numbers, for example, and so just the way that we understand the world would change depending on where we grow up and what we're exposed to. Wow, look at how long this title is. Bronfenbrenner's Bioecological Systems Theory. Let's break this down into its parts. Systems theory, so a theory is an overarching scheme of categorizing information. The systems part means that there are multiple loops that are already included by themselves. So a system is just distinct on its own, and so there are multiple of these systems. Bioecological, so the biological would be some of those systems are biological. The ecological part of that would mean that some of the parts are ecological, and so we're not just talking about cells and tissue and organs and organ systems and organisms, but we're also talking about how there exist ecosystems of multiple organisms, so like humans and trees and animals and sun, like these are all the ecosystems, or like a human ecosystem. I'm in an office with like office furniture. When I go in the classroom, I'm surrounded by students, and so this is like a human professor ecosystem. So it's not just like the biology stuff, but it's also the biology being expressed in a specific ecosystem, and then ecosystems interacting. So we might have like a desert ecosystem or a rainforest ecosystem or like a college professor ecosystem. But yeah, Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory. In each of these, we start with a very narrow circle. We're only looking at how cells develop. Now we're looking at how the human body develops. Now we're looking at how a human's culture influences how this human's body develops. Now we're looking at how multiple systems all fit together to help us understand how this one person develops. We're getting bigger and broader and more expansive, but that helps us understand just how vast developmental theory can become. So the little hierarchy of circles, or the concentric circles that I just drew, we have the micro, meso, exo, macro, chrono. And so those are just broader ways. It's like we're widening the lens to see more and more of the picture as we go out. Now, what's closest to the center is probably the most impactful, and the further out we get, we're seeing less impact, but more of a broader global sort of impact. The widest is how we exist in this particular moment of time, whereas the micro is like right what's happening to us right at this moment. Dynamic systems theory, we've got the systems theory part. Dynamic just means that those systems are constantly changing, and my guess is those systems are reciprocally interacting. So yeah, emphasizes interactions between biological maturation, environmental circumstances, constraints, and then individuals' drive to engage with the world. What does this mean? It means that you're trying to do your best as a college student, as a college professor, as a future counseling psychologist. You're working at it. But as you work at it, there's certain biological predispositions that you have that make part of that process easier, part of it harder. The people who are around you, you'll recognize some of them are supporting that development, others are holding you back. But that happens within a greater social system that tells us how we're supposed to be working and how we're supposed to relate to each other. And that all fits right. And so we're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Ethologists study the evolutionary basis of behavior. If I back up, the behaviorism or the behaviorists believe that we were born as blank slates. So I became a college professor, according to behaviorists, only because I was exposed systematically to people who shaped my development into becoming the college professor that I am. But ethologists would argue, and have effectively argued, that there was something genetic about what I was interested in, for example, what I was good at, and no amount of shaping could have made me better at these things. It was simply I was predisposed to enjoying teaching or enjoying reading, probably reading and writing, that allowed me to develop those skills a lot and become, to rise to a very high level of scholarly achievement. And so that would be written into evolution. Some really funny studies that were done in behaviorism, but I won't get into that. Evolutionary development theory then applies this principle of evolution to help us understand why we grow the way that we do. And again, that's the genetic predisposition to certain skills, talents, and growth that are actualized given our environmental opportunities for actualizing them. All right, so those are the theories of development. Now we're moving on to how research moves forward. Probably the biggest strategy or the biggest method is the scientific method. The scientific method uses experimentation to test hypotheses in probably the most rigorous way. We also have naturalistic observation. That's when we watch things that occur naturally. So maybe we go to an elementary school and watch children interact with a teacher, and we can understand cognitive development in kids, emotional development in kids, social development in kids, simply by watching it happen in as it's occurring naturally. We're not manipulating conditions. Structured observation is just the way of making a detailed record. So we're not just kind of like watching what happens. We are, we might create a class and invite children to come be taught. Whereas if I visited a class that was already in session, these students would have been going to this class anyway. It's part of their legal responsibility as citizens to attend school. And so I'd be going and watching what happens naturally. Structured observation, I might invite 20 kids to come be taught by a teacher. Self-report is simply asking people to answer questions about themselves. And so one of the criticisms there is how accurate can someone be when they're talking about themselves if they don't quite understand all of the rigors that go into scientific inquiry. But maybe we want to interview someone or ask them or give them a questionnaire, give them a survey. There are a whole bunch of physiological measures like brain imaging and skin imaging. And so there are a variety of, so the EEG, CT, PET, fMRI are all ways of looking underneath the skin. I believe the diffusion tensor imaging looks at skin conductance, or what's happening on the surface of the skin. Double check that. Other methods might include case studies, which are in-depth looks at single individuals who have experienced something unique, typically. Correlational research is a statistical method that looks at pre-existing data and compares two variables and see what the relationship is. Experimental research we've already mentioned. Oh, this is Basic Research Design 101. Boy, this chapter covers quite a bit. An entire semester could be spent going over research design. Um, I'm going to leave that to you to look into in more detail. But these are the basic parts of conducting an experiment. We have individual variables. That would be, for example, um, social development might be a dependent variable. We want to see how well children can develop social skills. Now, an independent variable might be teaching. And so maybe a certain class on teaching kids to start a conversation. And so that would be the teacher organizing the workshop or organizing the class would be the independent variable. Whether or not these kids develop their skills, that would be the dependent variable. If we want to do a controlled experiment, we would have one group of students. I'm sorry, I told you I wouldn't go into all this. Take a look at those definitions in the textbook. I think I'm already at like 40 minutes. I apologize for that. I'm going to have to find a way to pare these down. Research in human development. These are ways of looking at human development over a lifespan. So the human lifespan is like 80 some years now, and all we can really have access to is one moment of time. And so there are some methods that try to look at maybe a few decades. And so we can look at cross-sectional research, which might go out today and compare people in their 50s to people in their 40s to people in their 30s. So you're taking a cross-section of society as it exists right now. Longitudinal research, so I'm skipping one. Longitudinal research looks at one group, so maybe 20-year-olds who are 20 right now, as they grow into their 30s, their 40s, and their 50s. Now that's going to take 30 years, or that right there would take 30 years as opposed to 6 weeks if we do cross-sectional. And so there are benefits and detriments to both. The cohort takes into consideration in cross-sectional research why or how some of the differences between people in their 40s and people in their 20s might be explained not so much by age, but by when they grew up. So if you're in your 40s, you're probably a Gen Xer, which means that internet was invented when you were in high school, or really internet became accessible when you were in middle school or high school. So you didn't grow up with the internet. Social media didn't occur until you were employed. And so let's say you don't like using the computer. Is that because you're 40 or because you didn't grow up with a computer? And so we would have to take into consideration that cohort effect. Sequential research, assess multiple cohorts over time. Okay, so that would be like longitudinal research and cross-sectional research combined. You take people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then watch them as they grow up over the decades. That's a big project, I imagine. All right, we've only got 3 slides left. Let's get through this. Ethical research. There are certain steps to help you ensure that your research is safe for human subjects. You can read about those. If someone's involved in your research, they need to understand the possible downsides of participation. And if they are children, so that means they give their consent. If they're children, they are legally unable to give consent, and so they can only give what's called assent, which means they think they understand, but only their parents can give actual consent. And then confidentiality means you will keep their information confidential. You won't share it, and so they're protected. Applied developmental science. So science would be the application of scientific reasoning. Development means that application of scientific reason is on human development. And then applied means we're talking about solving real problems that maybe teachers want to understand better, or counselors want to understand better. And so these are real, this is doing research and solving real world problems at the same time. Most of the research that I've conducted lately has been applied. Intersectionality, I really hate this word because it becomes this buzzword catch-all term. But all we're talking about is things that, factors and variables that interact with each other. So that's not one thing by itself. It's multiple factors that all kind of have an impact, even though we often don't take them into consideration or account for them. And so some of the big ones, when you hear the buzzword intersectionality, is the factors of power differences. So gender discrimination, racial discrimination, age discrimination. Most companies don't say, like, we support the hiring of young people and do not support the hiring of old people. But their practices may reflect that age discrimination or gender discrimination or racial discrimination. And so, even though there's no stated policy against discrimination or in favor of discrimination, it may still occur because there are these hidden forces, cultural forces, social forces. Um, and so, being able to investigate how these um, intersecting factors come together is vaguely referred to as intersectionality. I don't like the word. I think the topic is really important, though, however. And that's it. We've reached the end of chapter 2. I'm going to have to take a look at these in the future and make sure they're not all 33 slides, because that's a lot of material to cover. But maybe it is about what would take 3 class periods, 3 1-hour class periods to get through sincerely. But that's what we got so far. So hopefully this was useful. And it's a starting point to help you understand chapter 1 of Kuther's lifespan development in context.